My name is Ray Paik. I'm here with my friend Fatih. There's been a lot of discussion about commercial open source software versus foundations. So that's a topic of our talk, and we have a quick intro slides. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. I'm a community manager for TidyB, which is a distributed SQL database, a project that's been around for a little over 10 years. And I'm located in the Bay Area and started managing open source communities back around 2014. I mean, this is how I met Fatih. I was working at the Linux Foundation at the time, and Fatih was one of our most active contributors to our networking project. Like a fun fact about me, or a cautionary tale, I do spend too much time talking and obsessing over soccer. So if you run into me, if you don't like soccer, that's something that might happen. So Fatih, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Ray. Hi, everyone. As Ray said, we met with Ray about 10 years ago. He was my community manager, and he was one of the best community people I ever met, and we still are friends. And that's one of the beauties about open source. You make friends which go for years. And as you can guess from my background, I am living in Stockholm, Sweden. And again, as Ray mentioned, I've been a contributor to open source for more than 10 years, which is when I met with Ray. And over the years, I contributed different open source communities, and I ended up working for Linux Foundation around 2022. So I worked on the other side of the fence as well. As opposed to being a community member, I worked at the Linux Foundation helping the community members there. And currently I work for SUSE, which is an open source company, as a senior manager there, working with CI/CD, QA, and infrastructure. And similar to Ray, I spend more time than Ray obsessing over football. We don't call it football in soccer in Europe. We call it football. And yeah, I am a fan of Galatasaray. We have a Champions League game tonight, so I'm pretty excited about that as well. So that's all. Please go ahead, Ray.
Right. Thanks. All right. Cool. So I think there was a session by Heather Meeker earlier today. She talked about commercial open source software. And a lot of commercial open source software the past several years generated a lot of headline because they made a decision for one reason or another to change their project licenses. I mean, basically, I'm generalizing here and oversimplifying things. Basically, they move from one of OSI approved licenses like Apache 2 to some variant of business source licenses. And business source license, if you're not familiar, is, I mean, you can still, you have full visibility of the source code, you can still make contributions, but they put a lot of restrictions on commercial usage of the software. And obviously, I'm simplifying things a lot, and I'm not a lawyer. But what has happened was that obviously when the licenses changed, the community members were not very happy for a very understandable reason. And what was interesting was that it's not just the community members from these communities, but open source, enthusiasts in general just were pretty vocal in criticism. And what has also happened as a consequence of these license changes was that some communities decided to fork these projects, like Open Source Valky and OpenTofu. I listed three as an example, and they not only fork these projects, but put these all under foundation governance. And correct me if I'm wrong, Fatih, I think all three of these are under the Linux Foundation. And then the narrative started developing. A lot of the conversations online, especially, were, the conversations went along the lines of, you can't trust commercial open source software companies anymore. Like, everything needs to be put under a neutral foundation. And I have an example of the conversation that took place 9 to 10 months ago on Hacker News, and you can read the whole conversation. And so somebody in the community made a post about TidyB, the database community that I'm managing. And it was just a simple link to our repo introducing TidyB. And pretty quickly, somebody jumped in and made a comment, hey, this is a VC-backed company. I mean, PinCap my employer is a company behind TidyB. This is a VC-backed company, and they also have a CLA. So this is a problem. Where's the community for it? That was a comment. And then if you read through the whole thread, somewhere down the chain, a person jumps in and says, "This is why you need to host everything under a foundation and have different companies collaborate." I think this is a point where I decided to sort of chime in. I didn't get flamed or anything, so hopefully, people saw it as sort of a constructive comment. I left a caveat saying I work for PinCap, but I also worked at foundations, and going to a foundation isn't a panacea either. So that's sort of the topic of our conversations. The comparison of two different funding models between commercial open source software versus something that's managed by a neutral foundation. Um, so in case you're not, too familiar, I just wanted to sort of, provide a background on how open source foundations work, because there's usually some misunderstanding of how open source foundations are organized. And obviously this is, again, a pretty broad stroke, because there are a lot of open source foundations out there, and they operate slightly differently. And also they have different governance depending on the project. But in general, like open source foundations are funded by member companies. Like you'll have several or even sometimes dozens of companies come together to pay their membership dues. It can range from just a few $1,000s a year to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the project and the membership level. And some projects also collect donations from individual donors, but as you can imagine, that's going to pale in comparison in general to what member companies provide through their membership fees. And the governance and leadership of these projects in general are done through community elected leadership groups, such as governing boards, and also different steering committees. Like a good example is technical steering committee. They'll make decisions as a group on things like release cadences, when releases are approved, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, in partnership with these leadership groups, you have foundation staff. For example, you'll have like an executive director. Fatih was an executive director for CD Foundation, an example, and you'll have people taking care of marketing and PR. And other aspects of the project operations will be taken care of in a lot of cases by foundation staff, in addition to community volunteers. And the important thing that I want to point out, the other support that you typically get from foundation staff is anything regarding like managing your IP matters, such as licenses and copyrights. So that's in general pretty broad stroke how foundations are run, and obviously this is very different from how commercial companies like operate, including commercial open source software companies. And apologize, this is a bit of an eye chart. Just wanted to have a chart comparing how commercial open source software companies would operate versus foundation-based projects. I won't go through everything in detail. Obviously, for commercial open source software company, it's led by like a single company, and then the funding for engineers and product teams and infrastructure and all that will come from things like companies' revenue, also from investments from outside, including VCs, and contributions, not surprisingly, will come mostly from that company, because that company, through that funding mechanism, is paying for those engineers. Same thing for like a product management team, for example. However, this is something I'll talk about again in a few minutes, is that as a community member, you have a role in shaping how the company and community is run. That's one of the unique things about commercial open source software companies. So just those are some of the things that I wanted to highlight on commercial open source software companies. And on the foundation-based side of things, on the right side of the table, I think I covered most of these. And I mean, Fatih, I guess as a transition, like maybe you can point out a few things here that you can move over to your slide.
Yeah. So again, as you mentioned, Ray, like the foundation-based companies, or sorry, foundation-based open source projects, they are generally formed by multiple companies coming together who share common interest or common business needs to, ensure the technologies developed by open source communities are developed in a fair and collaborative manner. And that is actually one of the key things about foundation-based projects, because it is kind of everyone contributes funding, contributes developers, contributors to ensure the project has healthy finances and developer community around. Again, the other key thing to highlight here, reiterate here, is like the project and feature priorities decided by technical committees, and these technical committees are formed by the community members in a meritocratic manner, as opposed to commercial company-based projects. So when it comes to longevity and sustainability of foundation-based projects, as Ray mentioned, as someone who worked at the Linux Foundation, leading the Continuous Stair Foundation, as staff, you have to work with many of the things that ensure the health and sustainability of the projects that are hosted by the foundations. And one of the key things that is not too visible by the community members, because I was a community member in the past, is how the foundations can stand on their own feet financially. And some of us might take the funding perspective as grant because the project we are contributing is hosted by a foundation. But it's actually, that's not the case. And as I shown on this slide, is like foundation hosting doesn't mean guaranteed funding. Even though you might have members there, if you lose one or a few members and lose their contributions financially, the projects hosted by the foundation can struggle. And this is especially important because, as Ray mentioned again, the funding the foundations get from member companies is actually used to support the projects hosted by the foundation. For example, the cloud infrastructure used by the projects, the version control systems used by the projects, they're all paid by the foundations. And depending on the size of the projects hosted by the foundations, the costs for such infrastructure resources could vary between tens of thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Obviously, this depends on how large the project is. So it is important we as community members to do our due diligence and ensure we don't use foundation financial resources for unnecessary reasons. And another way to ensure the foundation continues getting funding and doesn't get hurt by the members leaving, it is important to have the funding provided by diverse and reliable way by multiple member companies. So this is one of the key things, because if the projects lose their infrastructure, if the projects lose their events, that kind of hurts the projects themselves. And the second, perhaps even more important thing, is the contributor diversity. If there are a few companies taking part in projects that are hosted by the foundations, and if those companies are relied more than necessary, one or more of those companies leaving the project communities hurt the projects, because their developers most likely will not be allowed to contribute to those projects any longer, because company priorities shifted and they want to have their contributors, developers working on some other company-specific priorities. And similar to funding, it is necessary to have a broad contributor base. So all the companies, all the community members should be coming from different companies, so departure of one or more companies don't actually hurt the contributor community, and the projects can continue developing the features their users require or fix the bugs. And finally, shifting company strategy. And this could result in different things. I don't want to mention any project names, but a few months ago, one of the projects hosted by one of foundations, the creator of the project attempted to change the license of the project, and that actually hurt the community a lot. Even though the license change didn't take place, some of the contributors actually stopped contributing to the project, and some of the users started looking for alternatives for that project. So that is one aspect of shifting company strategies. The company who formed the projects originally and contribute to that project to foundation might attempt to change the license. And the other thing, again, the company may deprioritize the project, and similarly to lack of contributor diversity, the company might altogether depart the project, and the project might kind of become an abandonware or something like that. And no foundation can help with that. If the project doesn't have enough contributors, the foundation is not going to, hire people to contribute to the project. It is community-based development in the end. And to avoid license changes or avoid, projects becoming abandoned, it is important to ensure that governance adopted by the projects hosted by the foundations is transparent and inclusive. So anyone who is taking part in the projects, whether it is employed by the companies or people coming and contributing their free time, they should be allowed and welcome to contribute to governance aspects of the projects as well. And finally, the longevity and sustainability of the foundation-based projects need shared commitment, not just foundation. Foundation gives necessary vehicles, funding, marketing, events, and so on, but the companies taking part in the projects hosted by the foundation and the contributors contributing to the project must know that this is a shared commitment. It's not just, there's a foundation there, everything will be all right. No, that's not the case. So if you look at company-led open source projects, and we have a few projects highlighted here, and they are, successfully company-backed or commercial open source projects. Just a few, some of them, because I work in CI/CD ecosystem and I've served in Container Foundation, Jenkins is dear to my heart. Jenkins is one of the most popular and well-known automation engines, CI/CD engines, and that project is hosted by a commercial company, but it's pretty healthy. Actually, they have thousands of developers, contributors, and they have quite good credibility, and they keep on developing new features and shipping bug fixes continuously. Grafana, GitLab, they're also similar. They're also backed by commercial open source companies, but they're also, quite successful. So, as I said, foundations help and stir the open source projects, but companies also do similar things. Strong company stewardship actually can drive long-term success for the projects and ensure the projects could stay viable and sustain long-term development. Another potential good thing about the company-led open source project is sometimes companies might help the community take decisions faster and focus on what actually users need rather than making themselves spread thin across many different things. So the company leadership enables focused decisions, faster progress, and current roadmap. Also, companies, obviously, they're commercial entities. They have funding. They can actually help the community with infrastructure support, with events, and so on. So continuous funding could actually allow communities to maybe not think about financial aspects much because there's a commercial entity behind. And also, again, Ray mentioned there have been some license changes, but majority of the company-led open source projects don't do that. And the licenses are pretty stable there. And if you look at last decade, only about 20 license changes happened for such commercial backed open source projects. And this QR code actually will take you to a document hosted on GitHub, which you can see which open source projects change their license from open source license to commercial licenses. So it's again, commercial company-led open source projects actually have pretty stable licensing, which actually kind of makes people have peace of mind when it comes to if the license will change, do I need to look for a different project to fill the gap for this project? So that is the company at open source project. So Ray, we are back to you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Fatih. Yeah. And then GitHub repo that Fatih just referenced with the list of companies that changed their licenses. I mean, want to thank Don Foster, who is very active in the chaos community. That's her repo. That's obviously public. Yeah. So I think we're at sort of final stretch here. One of the questions that I often get, I mean, I just realized over the past 10 plus years, I spent more time at commercial open source companies rather than the foundation. And one of the questions that I often get from community members is that, how can we as community members or open source user influence, commercial open source software companies? And there are a couple of things that I want to address. I mean, first is like active engagement. I mean, if there's an active community that's engaged with the company, the company is going to have a lot of difficulty ignoring that active community. I mean, you ignore that community at peril, basically. And when I talk about engagement, I'm not just talking about like contributions to like in terms of code in the repository, but if you're very active providing feedback on the product, you're actively advocating on behalf of the community with blog posts, hosting meetups, or speaking at conferences. I mean, you're bringing something extremely valuable to the company, and that active engagement is very appreciated. And then obviously, can't be ignored, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that that active community doesn't necessarily guarantee that there won't be any license changes, as we've seen from examples, but it does, definitely make it harder, right? Because it's going to be very difficult to ignore the wishes of the community. And the other thing that I mentioned to a lot of community members is that don't hesitate to get in touch with people at the company. Because I think people feel a little defensive. Hey, I'm just a community member. Like, what right do I have to talk to somebody at the company? I mean, you do. I mean, one of the things when I was at GitLab that uh, that our CEO Sid talked very often and reminded us constantly was that as a company employee, you're also a community member. You're a fellow community member. So when as a member of the community, you talk to the employees. I mean, you should feel comfortable, confident talking in equal footing. I mean, you have the right to speak up, and if the company's worth their salt, I mean, they should be paying attention to what you have to say. Obviously, as long as you're constructive. And even if you're not a paid user, the value you get from the software, the feedback you have is going to be very relevant and relatable to, I mean, people that are paying millions of dollars, for example. So, I mean, don't be shy and feel comfortable and confident enough to continue contributing and voice your opinions. So that's a quick tip that I wanted to share for people that are working with commercial open source software projects. I think we have one last slide, some closing thoughts that both Fatih and I will share. And obviously, I don't know what your impression was when you first read the abstract or the title of the talk. The question of, should it be commercial open source software company or foundation that's leading your project? I mean, I think it's one of those questions that unknowingly comes to the answer. It really depends on the nature of the problem you're trying to solve and your project. For example, if you're trying to address common infrastructure pain points that a lot of people can relate to, a lot of companies can relate to, it's a lot easier to get several or even dozens of companies to come together and try to solve the same issue rather than each of those companies sort of reinventing the wheel in their own silos, solving the same problem over and over again. That's sort of a natural type of project where it makes sense to come together under a neutral foundation. But if that's not the case, if your team or company is addressing what a lot of people view as sort of a narrow use case or a lot of people can't relate to, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to come together with several other companies and put the project under a foundation. So I think it really depends on the type of the project you have, and it's overly simplistic to make a judgment saying, you know, it should always be, led by a commercial company or a foundation. I think it really depends. I mean, Fatih, you probably have some, parting shots that you want to leave. But
Yeah, I think you summarize it pretty well. I mean, yeah, it's regardless of if this foundation backed or company backed, the projects need people. So if you are interested in contributing to communities, just go and contribute to them, and I'm sure you will get a lot of help from there, and you will take part in navigating, helping the project grow even further. So that's all.
yeah. I mean, I definitely echo that. As a community manager, like I don't notice the difference in impact that community members have, whether it's foundation based or commercial open source software. So active engagement is dear to my heart. So yeah, I think that's our, sort of our closing thoughts.